So while she's going to share her screen, I'm going to introduce Emily. But before I do that, let me just say that Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy research organization that informs the public about the issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. Their mission is to generate a foundation of facts that enriches the public dialogue and support sound decision-making, and they do not take policy positions. So when you ask your questions, please ask questions that are relevant to Emily's presentation. So Emily is a research associate focusing on internet and technology research at Pew Research Center, and much of her recent work has focused on online privacy and safety, the digital divide, internet use during COVID-19. She received her master's degree in cognitive and affective sciences from University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh, and her bachelor's degree in psychology and human development from University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Emily is currently finishing her doctorate in experimental psychology. Emily, you have the floor. Welcome to our conference.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today. So as you mentioned, I'm here to talk to you all about some research that I was a part of at Pew Research Center. And the presentation that I'm giving here today is based on an interactive data essay we recently released. And it was entitled Americans and Cancel Culture, where some see accountability, others see censorship and punishment. So as we approached this research and thinking through how we wanted to study it, a question that came up is, what is cancel culture? And do Americans know what this term means? Personally, I'm fascinated by the etymology of words, and the phrase cancel culture is said to have originated from a relatively obscure slang term, cancel, meaning breaking up with someone, which is said to have originally started with the song Your Love Is Canceled from Chic in 1981. For about 30 years, cancel held the meaning of breakups. We see this in television, film, and in songs. But as the years go by, we see the term start gaining a new meaning on social media as an expression of disapproval. And within a few years, we see the term cancel culture arise. While this may be the history of the term, it tells us very little about how the general public sees this term, their familiarity with the term, and what they might think about the behaviors associated with it. So we reached out to some experts in the area to get their lay of the land of cancel culture and the related discussions. And from those conversations, we arrived at 4 fundamental research questions. My slides will actually progress. There we go. So we wanted to know, who has heard of cancel culture? When you're in the midst of studying this, talking about this, it seems like it's everywhere, but is it actually something that most people in the general public have heard of? And among those who have heard the term, what do they think it means? We were also curious about the behavioral side of these incidents. So from the conversation with experts, we saw this tension of when people call out others on social media for potentially offensive content, do people see it as holding people accountable or punishing those people? And with that tension in mind, we were curious why people hold that stance. We conducted our research using the American Trends panel. This is a panel exclusive to the Pew Research Center. We have about 15,000 panelists. For this study, we used a little over 10,000 of them. The panel is weighted to be representative of the American population using gender, race, ethnicity, partisan affiliation, education, as well as other categories to ensure that it is representative of the population. We had a margin of error of plus or minus 1.6 percentage points, and we fielded this survey about a year ago, so September 8th through the 13th, 2020. So this was in the lead up to the presidential election in the US. So while we weighted the sample to be representative of these partisan breaks, because I'm going to be focusing in on a good deal of partisan differences in this talk, I wanted to highlight that 45% of our sample was Republican or leaned towards the Republican Party. So that had a margin of error for that, for those breaks of 2.3 percentage points, where Democrats and those who leaned Democratic took up about 50% of the sample with a margin of error of plus minus 2.2. So who has heard of cancel culture? We wanted to ask this question because, like I said, when you're studying it, it feels so pervasive. But what we found is that only about 44% of the American population had heard at least a fair amount or a great deal about cancel culture. In fact, we see that 56%, majority by a slim margin, had heard nothing at all or not too much about this term. And when we look at the partisan breaks, while we sometimes think of this as a partisan issue, it is not that Democrats or Republicans are more or less likely to have heard of this term. In fact, what we see is that those on the ideological margins, those conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats, who are more likely than their more moderate counterparts to have heard of this term. So we wanted to ask the individuals who had heard of cancel culture, so the 44%, we asked them an open-ended question. In your own words, what do you think cancel culture means? And so they were able to respond with whatever they wanted. We then used inductive coding, and 8 key themes emerged in terms of what people seem to be describing cancel culture as. So among the 44% of US adults who had heard at least a fair amount about cancel culture, we see that the most common description that they provide is actions taken to hold others accountable. So about 49% said that cancel culture is actions taken to hold others accountable, while about 14% described censorship of speech or history. We see 12% talking about mean-spirited actions taken to cause harm to others. And we see smaller shares talking about people canceling anyone they disagree with, that people who are challenged online face offline consequences like being fired or boycotted. About 5% say that cancel culture was an attack or is an attack on traditional American society. About 4% talk about cancel culture as being a way to call out racism, sexism, and other social ills. And we see a small share, 2%, saying that the term cancel culture is a misrepresentation of people's actions. And there were about 8% of responses who did not fall clearly into any of these response categories. So I wanted to walk you through some of these open ends because they're so rich and fascinating to really kind of dive in to see what people had to say. So we see here a woman in her 50s, a moderate Democrat, describing cancel culture as accountability, saying cancel culture is a method of withdrawing support for public figures or companies. It can also be considered to be used as a form of online shaming in social media platforms. A woman in her 30s, a liberal Democrat, says cancel culture is a movement to remove celebrity status or esteem from a person, place, or thing based on an offensive behavior or transgression. While these quotes themselves are not necessarily stating clear favor or opposition to cancel culture or these attempts at accountability, I do want to highlight that there were individuals who overtly said, people are trying to hold others accountable, but this is misplaced, ineffective, or overtly cruel. So it's not that inherently accountability was seen as a positive thing. When we look at some quotes here from people who are saying cancel culture was censorship, I have a quote here from a man in his 50s, a conservative Republican, saying, cancel culture is trying to silence someone who does not have the same beliefs as you. Basically, it's taking their First Amendment rights away. It violates affected people's civil rights. We see a man in his 70s, moderate with no partisan leaning towards Democrats or Republicans, say, cancel culture means rewriting history and stopping the acknowledgement of facts because they are offensive to racial, religious, ethnic, economic groups, etc. It is rewriting of history to make people comfortable by ignoring facts, things that really happened, good or bad. And lastly, I'm going to share a few quotes from some individuals who talked about cancel culture as a mean-spirited action to harm others. So we see here a man in his 50s, a conservative Republican, say, cancel culture is destroying a person's career or reputation based on past events in which that person participated, or past statements that person has made, even if their beliefs or opinions have changed. On this other side of the slide, I have a quote from a man in his 20s, a liberal Democrat, saying cancel culture is a synonym for political correctness, where words and phrases are taken out of context to bury the careers of people, a mob mentality. So on this slide, we see a conservative Republican and a liberal Democrat both expressing the similar view. But I wanted to highlight that conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats often hold very different definitions of cancel culture. So if we look here, this is just a few of the different themes that we saw emerge from the 44% who had heard at least a fair amount about cancel culture. We see that liberal Democrats were very different from conservative Republicans on saying that cancel culture is actions taken to hold others accountable, with conservative Republicans who had heard of the term being much less likely than the liberal Democrats to say that it was actions to hold others accountable. Conversely, we see that these conservative Republicans were more likely to say that it was censorship of speech or history. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that they're also much more likely to say that it was an attack on traditional American society. Since cancel culture can mean different things to different people, we also wanted to look at a particular behavior. Specifically, we wanted to look at calling out others on social media for posting content that might be considered offensive. We wanted to know whether people saw this as punishing people or holding them accountable. And we wanted to then dive in to understand why. So we see that about 58% of Americans say that when you call out content on social media that might be offensive, you're more likely to hold the person accountable. Well, about 38% say that this punishes people who don't deserve it. When we look at this overall general population number, it kind of loses the nuance and the stark differences between Republicans and Democrats. So when we look at that partisan break, we see that Republicans are more likely to say that it punishes people who do not deserve it, while Democrats point out that they see calling out others as holding people accountable for their actions. So we really need to understand this partisan difference when we talk about whether people see calling out others as punishment for accountability. So we wanted to dive in and understand why they thought it was accountability or punishment. And as we go into this, I just want to remind people that while punishment, a greater share of Republicans mentioned that code, and for accountability, a greater share of Democrats mentioned that response. Once Democrats and Republicans had sorted into either punishment or accountability, the responses and themes that we saw from this open-ended question looked very similar. So we do not separate each of these codes out further by partisanship, but when we go through some of the open ends, you can see a variety of quotes from both Republicans and Democrats. So why do people think that calling out others on social media is accountability? Well, among the 58% of US adults who said calling out others was a form of accountability, we see 11 key themes emerge encoding these open-ended responses. The most common response was that it was a teaching or learning moment, that it was an opportunity to inform someone and help them understand why what they said was offensive. The next most common response is that people needed to consider the consequences of what they say. Smaller shares point to social ills such as racism or sexism would be exposed by calling out these incidences. that people need to think before they speak, especially online, that calling out others on social media in and of itself is a form of accountability. And we see that about 5%, although they said initially that it was accountability, kind of backtrack and say, well, it's accountability in some situations, but in others, it could be punishment. It's complicated. It has a bunch of nuance and difficulty in parsing this apart. We see that 4% mention things said online matter, and that's why people need to call out others, and it's a form of accountability. Another 4% mentioned that saying nothing suggests that you accept what the person says. And very small shares bring up that it's a step towards a better society, that it's important to have people explain themselves, and about 2% point to their own personal experiences or anecdotes to explain why they see it as accountability. We similarly asked the 38% who said that they saw calling out others as punishing people who didn't deserve it, why they held those beliefs. And we see 13 key themes emerge from our coding of their open-ended responses. The most common response related to people need to consider the context in which a statement was made. And the next most common was that they felt that people were overreacting to the content they were seeing online. 12% of the adults who mentioned that calling out others was punishment said that it was a matter of free speech and evoked the First Amendment or other discussions of the importance of being able to speak freely. We see an 11% share saying that offensive is a subjective term. What I might consider offensive may not be offensive to someone else, and that people shouldn't necessarily be using their personal definitions of offensive to police others. We see smaller shares talking about social media being the wrong place for these conversations, that calling out others on social media might not solve anything and in fact may make things worse. And some people talk about if people are offended, they should take a different course of action. Instead of calling someone out on social media, you could delete them from your friends list. You could block their content. You could take the initiative to remove them from your feed without affecting their ability to post. We also see small shares talking about it's punishing people because people are just trying to force their views on others, that people will just cancel anyone they disagree with. A small share of adults who mentioned that they felt like it was punishing people who didn't deserve it say that they felt like white people were being marginalized by those who were calling out others. Small shares on the punishment side also mentioned, similar to the accountability side, having mixed views. While they initially said it was punishment, they did say, in these circumstances, it's punishment. In these circumstances, it could be accountability. It's complicated. There's a lot of factors here. There's mixed efficacy in these situations. We also see a small share talking about their own personal experiences and anecdotes to explain why they saw it as punishment. And lastly, a very small share bring up the theme saying that they see this as punishment because people are just trying to make themselves look good by calling out others. So after the quotes were coded, we noticed some similarities and groupings amongst the codes, both within and across the accountability and punishment open-ended questions. By grouping these codes into broad areas, we were able to identify 5 key areas of disagreement that respondents seem to be gravitating towards in their arguments for why they held their own views of calling out others as either punishment or accountability. Specifically, we see disagreements around such issues as whether people call out others are rushing to judge or trying to be helpful, whether calling out others on social media is a productive behavior, whether free speech or creating a comfortable environment online is more important, differing possible agendas of those who call out others, And lastly, there was a difference of opinion about whether speaking up is the best course of action to take if people find content online offensive. So I want to walk you through each of these 5 disagreements and share a few quotes. As we walk through these quotes, there's going to be bolded text that was added by myself just to highlight some key elements of these because some of the quotes can be quite long. So the first area of disagreement I want to talk about is whether people are rushing to judge or trying to be helpful. So among those who said that calling out potentially offensive content on social media is holding people accountable, about 20% had brought up something related to people trying to be helpful in these situations. Well, among those who said that it was punishment, about 35% say that people were trying to rush to judge. And we see things along those lines. So I have here a quote from both sides. Let's start with the accountability quote. We see a woman in her 70s, a moderate Democrat, saying, offensive comments must be addressed or diffused in a way that can bring a more positive understanding to the discussion. One changed mind is worth the effort. So suggesting that people are trying to be helpful in these situations. On the punishment side, we see a woman in her 60s, a conservative Republican, saying, it's too easy to be offended and not even try to understand the issue. Too often people say accept diversity, but are unwilling to listen to others' ideas. So we see this people rushing to judge and make assumptions without, listening to others or taking in the larger context. Next, we see this debate of whether or not social media is a productive behavior. So about 16% of the responses from those who said that calling out social media or calling out potentially offensive content on social media was accountability say that it is a productive behavior and evoke that. While about 13% of those who talk about calling out others on social media as punishment say that social media is not the right place for these conversations. So we see here a man in his 30s who sees calling out others as accountability says, calling out is the closest thing we have to crowd control on social media. On the punishment side, we have a man in his 40s, a conservative Republican, saying, groupthink is rampant on social media, and social media rewards those who virtue signal just to get affirmation. Some will ruthlessly attack people perceived to be in the wrong in order to get affirmation. So seeing this tension about whether or not people think that social media is a productive behavior or a productive place for these conversations. So next we have this tension between free speech and creating a comfortable environment online. The Pew Research Center has studied this tension in the past between free speech and creating a safe and comfortable environment online. And we saw this organically arise in the responses of our respondents in these open ends. And so we see that about 10% of those who say that calling out others on social media for potentially offensive content is holding them accountable, say that it's important to create these safe spaces online and that you need to be cognizant of what you're saying. Well, on the punishment side, we see 12% of those who say that it punishes people who don't deserve it, talk about free speech and the importance of being able to say what you want online. So we have here a quote from a person in their 20s, a liberal Democrat on the accountability side, saying people who promote and validate views that hurt other people should have to deal with the consequences of their actions. Well, on the punishment side, we have a woman in her 60s, a conservative Republican, saying, freedom of speech, the cure for speech you do not like is more speech, not less. We also saw in looking at these codes and in the open-ended responses, this tension of disagreements about the agenda of the person calling out others online. On the accountability side, we see about 8% of respondents discussing the agenda of these individuals, while about 9% of those on the punishment side bring up the agenda as the reason for why they hold their views. So we see here a man in his 40s, a liberal Democrat, saying, calling someone out brings attention to someone's ignorance on the topic. It propels them to educate themselves. On the punishment side, a man in his 50s, conservative Republican, says, these people think everything is offensive. They think all white people are racist and they have an agenda that will destroy this country. And last area of disagreement that we saw arising was this tension of whether or not people should speak up if they were offended, if that was the right course of action. And we see 4% of those who mention accountability say that silence suggests acceptance, that it's important to speak up if you don't approve of what you're seeing. While on the punishment side, there's 5% who say, if you don't like what you see, there's a better course of action than calling someone out. So we see here a man in his 60s, a moderate Democrat, say, if you do not say something, then you are giving your tacit approval. While on the punishment side, we have a woman in her 60s, a moderate Republican, say, if you don't like something posted, don't watch it, unfriend the person, delete the person's content from your stream. So as you're taking in all of these findings, I wanted to highlight some important considerations as you think about these results. First, I wanted to highlight is the time in which the survey was fielded. So I mentioned earlier that we fielded this survey last year in September of 2020, in the lead up to the election. As such, we cannot parse how more recent events and news headlines may have shifted familiarity with or views of the term cancel culture or the public's perceptions of calling out others. We do feel comfortable that we got a wide and diverse range of views about what cancel culture means, and the breadth and depth of those answers gives us confidence that we picked up much of the spectrum of what Americans feel and think about this, even though our question was before some of the more recent news stories. Next, I wanted to highlight that we focused on just one specific behavior. We chose to focus on calling out others, as it is a behavior that has received a fair bit of media attention and can be done by any one person to any one other person online. However, this does mean that we do not have assessments about other behaviors that are often associated with cancel culture. Next, I wanted to highlight that we did not do a sentiment analysis of these open-ended responses. So, as I briefly mentioned before, some of the folks who say that cancel culture was accountability, in defining what cancel culture was, they talked about actions to hold others accountable, but they might have, there was a small share that were saying that it was not a good thing. And conversely, there were respondents who were in favor of some forms of censorship. So we cannot say from merely the definitions whether people thought that this was a good or a bad thing in terms of what cancel culture is. Next, I wanted to highlight that while a majority of respondents answered our open-ended questions, there were notable shares who did not respond. And while those who did not respond may have held different views than those who did choose to respond to these open-ended responses. And lastly, while we asked about the behavior of calling out others, we did not ask about the term call out culture. I know this is another popular term used in some conversations on this topic, but as we did not ask about it directly, we cannot assess if people are familiar with this term, what they think the term might mean, or their views on this term more generally. So, some key takeaways. The term cancel culture is rife with disagreements, which are quite partisan in nature. There are even differences in opinion over what it means in a very drastic way, as we saw conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats holding very different views in how they define this. And these disagreements extend to people's views about the motives and intents and impacts of calling out others. So Democrats and Republicans also largely disagree about whether calling out others on social media holds them accountable for their actions or punishes people who don't deserve it. So we need to keep this in mind, that these are very partisan. And when we look at these debates on what the term means, or especially on whether calling out others is punishment or accountability, there are strong disagreements on almost every facet of these encounters, such as the intentions behind the behavior, whether these encounters can be productive, whether the important issue is free speech or creating a comfortable environment online, or whether people should even speak up. So lastly, I just wanted to point you towards some of the materials that the center has on cancel culture on our website. So the findings that I shared with you today are from an interactive data essay, Americans in Cancel Culture. It can be found on our website, or I've included a link here that should be pretty easy to remember and type in. So tinyc.cc/cancel culture. But we also have a few other studies on our website related to this topic area. So we just recently had a blog post go out about how Americans feel about cancel culture and offensive speech in 6 charts. And this highlights the findings in the interactive data essay, as well as the 2 other posts I have listed below. But if you're looking for a quick overview of the research that we have in this area, that's a great starting place. We also have a post entitled "Partisans in the US Increasingly Divided on Whether Offensive Content is Taken Seriously Enough." And this dives into some of those tensions about free speech and creating comfortable spaces, as well as whether people think that offensive content online is taken too seriously or not seriously enough. And lastly, there's some international research looking at political correctness and offensive speech across multiple countries. And so views about national identity become more inclusive in US and Western Europe is the title of the report, and specifically chapter 4, focusing on political correctness and offensive speech, has some information about how different countries compare to each other on views of this topic. So thank you all so much, and I will now open it to questions.
Thank you, Emily, for your wonderful presentation. Let's give Emily a round of applause first, and then I'm going to ask our moderator, Gidra Prige, our students of communication at George Mason University, to handle the Q&A session.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Emily. That was a wonderful presentation, and we all, I'm sure, learned so much. I'm going to start off with a question from our own Dr. Jennifer Cohane. She asks, can I ask why Pew Research Center was motivated to do this study? Clearly, everyone here sees cancel culture as an important phenomenon in US politics. Was that a strong feeling at Pew Research Center among the researchers? What led you guys to do this work?
So as we approach this topic, we'd been talking about it for several years before we started doing this, and we were hearing it come up in the cultural conversations, and it kept coming up and kept coming up, and it was coming up more and more. And as we were approaching the lead up to the election, we were very interested in the conversations people were having online, especially with the heightened political tensions at that point in time. So we were doing a lot of research on those online conversations. We did some research on online harassment and found some interesting findings with partisan affiliation being related to harassment and stuff like that. But we were really interested in the lead up to the election about this because it was increasing in the conversation, and we had a particular interest in conversations online at that point in time.
Awesome. We have another great question from James. James says, Emily, do you have any other variables that you explored rather than partisan affiliation? For example, race, education. Oh no, I might not be responding. My apologies if I cut out there for a second. The internet has been a little bit wacky. Do you have any other variables to explore other than partisan affiliation? For example, race, education, age, or socioeconomic status, how they relate to people's feelings on cancel culture?
We looked into these other variables, and in the essay online, you'll see that we share some findings in relation to familiarity with the term cancel culture, with younger folks being more likely to have heard of the term. Men are more likely to have heard of the term. But when we started looking at differences of views, the story was heavily partisan, and it was surprisingly so, because we thought that there might be some of these other differences, but it was so strong in the partisan differences where the others were not as consistent.
That's really interesting. We have another question here from Irina Zuckerman. She is asking, were there any answers regarding cancel culture's effectiveness as a tool for deterrence, or a tool to maybe prevent one political view that one side finds to be detrimental to the public discourse from being expressed? Did you find that people had thoughts about that, or did it really focus more on whether it's accountability or punishment?
So when we asked about the term cancel culture and asked people to tell us in their own words what they thought this meant, we did see conversation coming up about, certain groups being more likely to be targeted by cancel culture than others. We saw discussion of using these mechanisms to call out racism or sexism, but we also saw people saying like they're using it to try to silence my perspective, they're trying to silence my political identity. And so we did see this tension, and using these elements in that way, people were discussing it, but we did not code it in that way because we were trying to keep it more open to how they were defining it rather than the mechanism by which it was being used. So we have that broad category of like actions taken to hold others accountable, but we also had censorship, we had attack on traditional American values, which people sometimes evoked their, stances. I've been this way, this is my identity, and people are trying to tear this down, even though I've been able to live my life like this for years, and suddenly now I'm wrong.
That's really interesting, and it makes sense why you coded it that way. Leslie asks a question that is somewhat related to your answer. Did you see what the effect of cancel culture on the observers was, especially from the long answer portion of your survey? For example, the people that responded with personal anecdotes, have they tended to be impacted towards the cancel culture's punishment side, towards the accountability side, and what did that look like?
So people who brought up that they themselves had been targeted, those anecdotes were more often in the punishment side. Specifically, a quote stands out to me when we asked, calling out others on social media, why do you see it as punishment? Someone said, I lost my job because of my stance on Black Lives Matter, which was a very interesting and very straightforward quote of a personal anecdote for why they held their views. Some people went more in depth of, saying that they had experiences where they were saying something, but someone had taken what they said out of context and they felt that they had been misjudged. There were people who decided to talk about stories that they had read in the news more than their own personal experiences, and they felt that someone in the news had been mistreated. But we also see on the other side, people talking about like, I've seen people say this or that, and I felt it was super important to step up and say something, that this person should be called out for these reasons. And I thought that it was right that this happened in the news. So we see this tension with, personal experiences coloring, responses very clearly, but those were not the majority of responses. Most people were not evoking personal experience.
Great, that's really interesting. Divine asks a question which is related to when you discussed that the election was a big reason why you decided to pursue this line of research. Do you see cancel culture as having impacts or an interaction with the 2020 elections and election results? And is there any forecasting? Obviously, that's very, very difficult to do. Which side seems to be triumphing with results to the debate on cancel culture? And did you see any of that in your results?
So I think it would be a super interesting study to conduct and dive into those interrelationships. We did not asked directly about that, so we don't necessarily have data. In the open ends, the election did not come up that much, which I don't know if people would find that surprising or not when asking about this topic, but it was not a heavily mentioned thing. Most people were talking about their views and were not evoking news stories. They were not evoking, public figures informing their stances. But like I said, in terms of like familiarity with the term, we did see partisan differences in just the ideological ends. So the liberal Democrats and the conservative Republicans were more familiar with the term, which means they were also more likely to get the follow-up question when we asked why they or what they thought it meant. So it may be that changes in times may shift that a little bit of having more of those more moderate individuals having perspectives, and maybe they would have a different experience of how they'd come to their definitions, but we cannot say that from our current data.
That makes sense. And I think you just answered that, but Leslie asks, did any of the respondents mention if they voted or intended to vote?
The open-ended responses, I do not recall any specifically mentioning their intention to vote. It was September, so it was not the point in time which they could be doing early voting. There's other research at the center that has done stuff on intention to vote, and you can see some of that data if people had interest there. We did not look at it directly. Some people did mention political figures, but again, super rare responses. There were a few people who mentioned Trump, both in the positive and the negative. Biden didn't come up that much in conversation, but yeah, it was not as prominent in their discussion about the election itself, despite it being a prominent topic in the culture at the time of the survey.
Gotcha. That's a really interesting finding. James has a follow-up on his earlier question about other variables that were studied or investigated. He asks, did you run a regression in which partisan affiliation washed out the effects of other variables, including age and gender, and are the results of those regressions available online anywhere?
So I'm going to try to remember all the things I did. I remember running a regression with partisanship on a few things early on, especially with race and ethnicity, and that washed out any effects there. We do not have results of the regression online because the story was so clearly partisan, so that's what we focused on. But I can highlight that Pew Research Center does share its data widely available online. I do not know if this study is currently listed on the website, but it will if soon if it is not currently, and that will allow people to dive into the data directly and run some of those regressions and stuff themselves if they're interested in doing so.
That's wonderful. If we have any statisticians and data nerds out here listening, which I'm sure we do, hopefully they will engage in that and take advantage of that. Let me find another question. Did you find in the open-ended responses, did anyone mention that they had engaged in canceling themselves and what led them to engage in it, or accountability, calling out, etc.? This question comes from Leslie.
I'd like to ask a follow-up on, by canceling themselves, are you saying like canceling someone else, or they?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Like they themselves engaged in canceling.
Okay, just wanted to clarify before responding. So there were individuals who had talked about having called out others for offensive content. There were individuals who said that they had engaged in what they called cancel culture and said that they saw it as a way to hold others accountable, or that they did it because they needed to call out racism or sexism in these definitions of cancel culture. There were individuals who talked about their own personal experience and engaging in that behavior. We did not code it out separately because we didn't ask people directly. So it would be a bit hard to try to estimate the share that had engaged in it themselves. But there was respondents who did mention in their definition of cancel culture having engaged in it.
Great, thank you so much. Now we have a question from Professor Sergey, and he asks, are there plans in the works at Pew to do another study on cancel culture? And what questions would it be interesting to explore if you did another survey?
We do not currently have set plans. There is obviously discussion of how it would be fascinating to dive back into this topic, but we'd have to figure out where it fits in our research agenda and, funding and all of that. If we were going to ask this again, I think right away, the first question that we definitely would want to ask is one that we already asked, which is have you heard of the term? Because it would be great to get a trend going on this. We have our first data point last year, but with the increase of news coverage, especially considering like at the beginning of 2021, there were all of those cancel culture news stories floating around from Dr. Seuss, Mr. Potato Head, that just took off in a major way. I'm wondering now what the familiarity with the term cancel culture is. If we were going to ask about this again, something that we had talked about being an interesting topic to study, but we're not able to fit into the current one, is the mechanism by which people will forgive. So we see in news stories people being canceled, but oftentimes they're given, they do their time or they issue a statement, and eventually we see the public re-accept them in some way. And so we were very curious about that, but we couldn't fit into our current study to really dive into people's thoughts about that, what they think should be done. I think that would be a very fascinating area to dive into and explore more that we wanted to, but it is a difficult topic. We definitely tried to write some questions and it was just very hard to parse apart. And in the end, we chose to just try to go with the straightforward like starting point story. And so a follow-up study in this area, I think that would be a great place for us to try to dive in and understand.
I definitely understand that decision. And if you guys did do another survey on cancel culture, I would definitely be excited to read it. Sure, we can, speaking for everyone in the room. I have two questions here. I'm actually going to combine them into one because I think they're closely related. Professor Cohen asks, maybe this was beyond the scope of the study, but the polarization in the results is really striking. As you mentioned before, how it washes out every other variable. And she's curious where we're going to go from here. Do you think cancel culture is always going to have this strong partisan divide? And I did notice even in the results you mentioned, there was one answer from a liberal Democrat man, and it sounded like the answer sounded more like someone that believes cancel culture is punishment. So it's not always that there's this strong partisan divide, but do you think that's going to be the prevailing trend? And then Leslie asked something interesting. Do you think this is an issue of cause or effect? That Democrats, for some reason, just like cancel culture more? Or is it that right now they are more likely to be in one side, maybe the not getting canceled side of the culture? So they're liking it more. But if it just switched one day and the Republicans were canceling all the Democrats, do you think we would see a little bit of a switch in the results?
Until we have trend data, I feel a bit uncomfortable speculating about the partisan lines from other research that we've done on different topics. So for example, evoking the views of offensive content. And so we did a study on that. I mentioned it earlier. So when we look at people's views of offensive content online, is it being taken too seriously or not seriously enough? We have a trend on this, and we see that it's become increasingly partisan. So originally, our first data point, Republicans and Democrats did not differ in their views on this topic. But in recent years, it's become more partisan. And so I don't want to try to extrapolate what cancel culture might look like in a few years on the partisanship, because one data point does not a trend make. And in terms of personal experience coloring responses, I'll once again highlight that people who felt like they personally had been targeted unfairly definitely brought up that they thought that it was punished, like that's responses we saw on the punishment side. I can think of specifically in the punishment open-ended responses, there were some Democrats, I cannot remember moderate or, liberal, but there were some Democrats on the punishment side who did bring up that they had been targeted by being called out online and felt that they had been punished unfairly. So until we extrapolate further and have like very clear data to say that those are related, and be able to say that that is tied to the partisanship, I can't say for sure, but we do see that personal experience does seem to color. I did not see any open-ended responses where people were like, I got called out and I think it was accountability. Like that didn't show up in the open ends, but we did see the inverse.
That makes complete sense. And that connects to something someone else asked as a question, whether people in the open ends talked about themselves experiencing cancellation or online blowback. And yes, as you spoke to, people did talk about it. They were none too happy about it, etc. And definitely would not want you to engage in, rank speculation on the future state of our polity. But we really appreciate hearing what you've learned just from all of the research that Pew has done on this topic. We have 2 comments / questions from Professor Sharave and Cohen, and they wanted to discuss global attitudes towards cancel culture. So Professor Sharave says he would be interested to see in Pew's Global Attitudes Project cross-national trends related to cancel culture, and maybe even see if people are familiar with that term in other nations. And Professor Cohen is curious about the international resonance of this term. So whether it seems to be circulating in public spheres in other countries and in their political life.
So, well, I was not part of the research. The last study that I mentioned on my previous slide did do some international work on views of offensive content, and they did not use the term cancel culture in that. So do not have a reading on that. And if you were speaking to someone on that team, maybe they could explain and say like, oh, they had done preliminary research or something on that, but I was not part of those decisions, so I don't want to speculate on that. I think that there is definite interest in this topic in an international lens, as evidenced by this initial work that they recently did looking at this. But yeah, definitely we would be fascinated to see if the term has resonance in other countries. We do see some differences by country and views of offensive content in that study by our global team. So if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend checking that out and diving in. And if you're wanting to follow up and ask questions, I'm sure the people who were involved in that project would love to talk about it more.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the audience who are interested in checking that out. I want to hold a last call for any questions. If you feel the need, we do not have Emily all day. She, I'm sure, has things that she does in her life, and we will let her get on with them. But if people don't have any additional questions, I want to thank Emily so much for coming and giving this wonderful presentation and showing us all of Pew's and her fascinating efforts and work on this topic, because we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Very flattered. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
Well, if no one has any other questions for Emily, should we go ahead and take a break before reconvening our next panel at 10:30? Serge, what do you think?
I think it's a great idea, and then Martin will lead the next session.
Yeah, I think not all our panelists are here yet. So yeah, let's do that.
We got time, yeah.
Awesome. Then
Okay.
I'll just add before we take our break then, thanks again to Emily for coming. It's really wonderful to just see how much data there is out there, and someone who has such familiarity with how y'all coded it and all of the things that you saw went even above and beyond getting to read the report, which I did a couple of weeks ago. So thank you for
May I
sharing
add
that.
also, Emily, thanks. There is no single week I would not use Pew Research in my classes. So every week is something, and everybody should just visit you because incredible data. Yes, U.S. global, wonderful, reliable. So just you're better than Gallup. Yes, I can say better
We
than Gallup.
love Pew Research Center. Thank you, Emily. So pass our greetings to everyone.
I will.
very
Thank
much.
you so much.